The final question paradox presents a deeply intriguing and unsettling puzzle that challenges our understanding of ultimate knowledge and the limits of inquiry. It asks whether it is possible to pose a question so profound and definitive that no answer can ever be given, not because the question is meaningless, but because the nature of reality itself prevents any resolution. This paradox forces us to confront the boundaries between the knowable and the unknowable, a frontier where logic, language, and existence converge and break down simultaneously. At the heart of the paradox lies the tension between the human desire for complete understanding and the inherent constraints imposed by the structure of reality. If the question is truly final, meaning it encompasses all possible information and meaning, then any attempt to answer it would either be incomplete or self-contradictory. The paradox suggests that there exists a category of questions that are by their very nature unanswerable, not due to lack of information, but because answering them would create logical or ontological contradictions. The final question paradox invites us to consider the relationship between questions and answers as more than a mere exchange of information. It exposes a fundamental asymmetry. While questions seek to elicit answers, the ultimate question transcends this dynamic, becoming a boundary marker for cognition and language. This boundary defies the usual assumptions of classical logic, where every well-formed question is expected to have a definitive answer or at least a well-defined truth value. Philosophically, this paradox challenges the notion of omniscience and the pursuit of a theory of everything. If such a theory exists, it would need to resolve the final question, yet the paradox implies that the very idea of a complete and final answer may be an illusion. This has profound implications for epistemology and metaphysics, questioning whether absolute knowledge is attainable or if some mysteries are woven into the fabric of existence itself. The paradox also highlights a subtle distinction between the semantic limits of language and the metaphysical limits of reality. Language attempts to capture and frame our experience, but the final question transcends linguistic representation, existing at the edge where meaning collapses into silence or paradox. In this sense, it resonates with the ancient mystical traditions that acknowledge ineffable truths beyond human comprehension. While the final question paradox may seem to defy resolution, it ultimately serves as a mirror reflecting our own intellectual and existential humility. It compels us to accept that some aspects of reality might forever elude our grasp, inviting a contemplative silence rather than frustration. Through this acceptance, we find a strange kind of peace, where the quest for knowledge is balanced by the recognition of its inherent limits. In this way, the final question paradox is not merely a logical puzzle, but a profound meditation on the nature of knowledge, existence, and the quiet spaces between what can be asked and what can be answered. The paradox of the mind that cannot observe itself poses a profound challenge to our understanding of consciousness and self-awareness, suggesting that there exists an inherent limitation in the capacity of a mind to fully observe or comprehend its own totality. This paradox arises from the recursive nature of self-observation. For a mind to observe itself, it must first create a representation of itself within itself, but this representation can never be fully complete or separate, leading to an infinite regress or an unavoidable incompleteness in self-knowledge. At its core, this paradox questions whether consciousness can be both the observer and the observed simultaneously without loss or distortion of information. The act of observation itself demands a degree of separation between the observer and the observed entity. But when the mind turns inward to observe itself, this boundary blurs, and the mind encounters the impossibility of fully stepping outside of itself to gain a complete and objective perspective. Consequently, any attempt at self-observation is limited by the mind's own structural constraints and the dynamic, ever-changing nature of thought and perception. Philosophers and cognitive scientists have long debated the implications of this paradox, as it suggests that perfect self-knowledge or complete introspection may be fundamentally unattainable. The paradox highlights the difference between reflective awareness, which allows the mind to consider aspects of itself, and total self-observation, which demands an impossible level of detachment and completeness. It reveals the subtle distinction between knowing oneself through indirect representations and the elusive ideal of an unmediated, exhaustive self-perception. Moreover, this paradox intersects with concepts in logic and mathematics, such as Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which demonstrate limits on the ability of formal systems to fully capture their own properties. Similarly, The mind that cannot observe itself suggests that consciousness as a system may be subject to intrinsic limitations that prevent it from fully grasping its own entirety from within. While this limitation may seem discouraging, it also invites a deeper appreciation for the mysterious and complex nature of consciousness. It underscores the idea that self-awareness is a dynamic process rather than a fixed state, and that the mind's relationship with itself is characterized by ongoing exploration and partial understanding rather than final completeness. In essence, the paradox of the mind that cannot observe itself challenges our assumptions about introspection and self-knowledge, reminding us that the journey toward understanding consciousness is bound by subtle constraints that shape the very nature of awareness. It opens a contemplative space where the limits of observation become a fundamental aspect of the mind's profound and enigmatic architecture. The illusion of free will dilemma is a profound and unsettling concept that challenges our most deeply held intuitions about autonomy and choice. At its core, this dilemma explores the apparent contradiction between the subjective experience of making free decisions and the possibility that all our actions may be predetermined by prior causes, whether physical, biological, or even computational. The paradox arises from the tension between two fundamental perspectives. On one hand, we feel as though we are agents capable of freely selecting among multiple options, responsible for our choices. On the other hand, the deterministic laws of nature, or the constraints of causality and initial conditions, suggest that every event, including human decisions, is the inevitable outcome of preceding states. This dilemma forces us to reconsider what it means to act freely. If our brains and bodies operate according to fixed rules and chemical interactions, then the sensation of free will might be no more than an elaborate illusion generated by neural processes. Yet this illusion is compelling, intimately woven into our consciousness and moral frameworks. Philosophers and scientists have debated whether free will can be reconciled with determinism through compatibilist theories, which argue that freedom is about acting according to one's desires and intentions, even if those are causally determined. Alternatively, some propose libertarian views, suggesting that true free will requires actions to be indeterminate or uncaused, an idea difficult to ground in empirical reality. The illusion of free will dilemma also touches upon the implications for moral responsibility and self-identity. If our choices are preordained or governed by unconscious processes beyond our control, what does it mean to praise or blame individuals for their actions? This paradox unsettles the foundations of ethics, law, and society, which often presuppose that humans are autonomous agents accountable for their behavior. Neuroscientific studies have added complexity to this dilemma by demonstrating that brain activity associated with decisions can be detected moments before a person becomes consciously aware of their choice. These findings fuel the argument that consciousness may be more of a witness to decisions already made by subconscious mechanisms rather than the true originator of free will. Ultimately, the illusion of free will dilemma highlights the limits of human understanding regarding consciousness and causality. It invites us to examine the intricate interplay between deterministic laws, random processes, and subjective experience. This paradox does not offer easy answers, but instead opens a space for deep reflection on the nature of agency, the construction of self, and the meaning of freedom in a universe that may be far less free than it appears. In this way, the dilemma remains a poignant and humbling reminder of the mysteries that underlie the simplest acts of choosing and deciding, quietly urging us toward acceptance of uncertainty as we drift into restful sleep. The paradox of the impossible choice explores a fundamental dilemma encountered when an agent is confronted with a decision that defies resolution by any rational criteria, revealing a profound challenge to our understanding of choice and agency. At its core, this paradox arises when every available option seems equally viable or problematic, making it impossible to select a single course of action without contradiction or dissatisfaction. Unlike ordinary decision-making scenarios, where preferences or probabilities guide the choice, the impossible choice presents a scenario in which no such guiding principle exists or applies, leaving the chooser in a state of irresolvable indecision. This paradox highlights the limitations of classical decision theory, which typically assumes that an agent can always rank options or assign utilities, enabling a clear preference. Here, however, the conditions under which choices must be made resist any consistent ordering or comparison. Such situations may occur in philosophical thought experiments, ethical dilemmas, or highly abstract formal systems, where the criteria for decision collapse or become self-defeating. The paradox challenges the assumption that freedom of choice necessarily entails the existence of a rational or determinate path forward, calling into question the coherence of agency itself. Importantly, the paradox is not merely a psychological problem of anxiety or hesitation but reveals structural constraints embedded in the logic of choice. It suggests that there can exist decision problems where rationality, defined by consistency and maximization of utility, is fundamentally unattainable. Consequently, the paradox of the impossible choice forces us to reconsider the nature of freedom and responsibility, questioning whether true freedom requires the possibility of genuine decisive selection, or whether it entails accepting the coexistence of equally valid and invalid alternatives. From a formal perspective, this paradox intersects with topics in logic, game theory, and computational complexity, where it relates to problems that have no algorithmic solution or that require non-computable criteria to resolve. It also touches on the philosophical problem of moral dilemmas, where competing ethical duties provide no clear resolution. In this light, the paradox stands as a testament to the intricate and sometimes contradictory nature of decision-making in both human experience and theoretical models. By revealing that some choices resist resolution even under the most rigorous frameworks of rationality, the paradox of the impossible choice invites a deeper exploration of the boundaries of reason and the conditions under which choice loses its meaning. It prompts us to question whether our conception of freedom must accommodate uncertainty and irresolution as intrinsic features, rather than failures or anomalies, of decision itself. The non-existence awareness problem is a deeply intriguing paradox that challenges our understanding of consciousness and existence by questioning the nature of awareness in relation to non-existence. At its core, this problem asks whether it is possible for a being to be aware of its own non-existence, a concept that seems inherently contradictory since awareness typically presupposes some form of existence. The paradox arises because awareness, as we commonly understand it, requires a subject to observe or experience, yet non-existence implies the absence of any subject at all. This contradiction forces us to reconsider what it means to be aware and whether awareness can somehow transcend the boundaries of existence itself. Philosophically, the non-existence awareness problem explores the limits of self-reference and the boundaries of consciousness by posing a scenario where an observer tries to recognize or acknowledge a state of complete absence or nullity. It challenges the assumption that consciousness is always tied to physical or metaphysical presence, suggesting that if such awareness were possible, it would redefine our categories of being and nothingness. The problem also highlights the difficulty in describing or conceptualizing non-existence from the inside, since any attempt at awareness implies an observer, thereby negating the state of non-existence. This paradox has significant implications in metaphysics and the philosophy of mind because it touches upon the nature of self-awareness and identity. It forces us to ask whether our sense of self is contingent on continuous existence, or if it can be decoupled from it in some way. Furthermore, it raises questions about the relationship between language, thought, and reality, as discussing non-existence requires us to use concepts that may inherently rely on the presence of something to refer to. This circularity underlines the challenge in addressing non-existence within any coherent framework. In modern discourse, the non-existence awareness problem invites a re-examination of how we understand consciousness beyond physical constraints, especially in contexts like theoretical physics, existential philosophy, and even artificial intelligence. It emphasizes that awareness may be more elusive and complex than traditionally assumed, extending beyond the immediate domain of presence and pushing the boundaries of what it means to know or be. Ultimately, this paradox serves as a profound meditation on the interplay between existence, consciousness, and the ineffable realm of nothingness, inviting us to explore the profound mystery at the heart of our own being and the universe itself. The paradox of the forgotten future presents a deeply intriguing challenge to our understanding of time and memory, suggesting that the future, though it inevitably becomes the present and then the past, remains forever inaccessible to our conscious recollection until it has already passed. This paradox emerges from the tension between the linear progression of time, as experienced by human consciousness, and the elusive nature of future events that, while determined or influenced by present conditions, cannot be truly remembered until they unfold. At its core, the paradox questions how the future can be both fixed in some metaphysical sense, and yet remain forgotten, irretrievable until it is lived through and recorded in memory. The essence of this paradox lies in the asymmetry of memory, where the past is accessible and stored within the mind, allowing us to recall experiences and learn from them, whereas the future remains inherently unknowable and unremembered, despite the certainty that it will come to pass. Unlike past memories, future events cannot be encoded into our consciousness in advance, creating a fundamental gap in the continuity of experience that challenges notions of determinism and free will. If the future is predetermined, one might expect it to be, in some form, accessible or rememberable, yet our cognitive faculties restrict us to only anticipate or imagine it, never truly to remember it beforehand. Philosophically, the paradox of the forgotten future invites us to reflect on the limitations of human cognition and the nature of temporal awareness. It suggests that memory is intrinsically a backward-looking faculty, anchored in events that have ceased to be potential and have become actual. This characteristic underlines the dynamic flow of time, wherein each moment is lost to the past, rendering the future perpetually out of reach and always forgotten, until it transitions into the present. The paradox thereby underscores the role of consciousness as a temporal observer, bound by the directionality of time, and constrained by the mechanisms of memory formation. From a metaphysical perspective, this paradox also poses questions about the existence of the future independent of present awareness. Does the future have a definite form awaiting realization, or is it a landscape of possibilities that collapse into reality only as events occur? The paradox suggests that even if the future is fixed, it is essentially inaccessible in a meaningful way until it has passed, highlighting the delicate interplay between determinism, temporality, and human perception. This tension challenges simplistic views of time as merely a linear sequence, and opens discourse on the profound mysteries surrounding the flow of existence. The paradox of the forgotten future illuminates the intricate relationship between time, memory, and consciousness. It reveals that while the future inexorably shapes and becomes part of our lived experience, it remains forever beyond the grasp of direct memory or awareness, until it has ceased to be future at all. This paradox not only enriches philosophical inquiry into the nature of temporal experience, but also invites a quiet contemplation on the limits of knowing what lies ahead, encouraging a serene acceptance of the present moment as the true locus of awareness. The observer's prison paradox presents a deeply unsettling philosophical and cognitive dilemma centered on the nature of conscious observation and the apparent impossibility of verifying any reality beyond one's own perspective. It suggests that any observer may be fundamentally confined within the boundaries of their own subjective experience, unable to conclusively determine whether an external world truly exists or whether any other conscious entities possess awareness independent of their appearance. This condition can be likened to a prison in which the bars are not physical but epistemological, built from the limitations of perception, inference, and the inherently private nature of consciousness. The paradox raises the question of whether it is ever truly possible to escape the solipsistic enclosure that surrounds each sentient mind, because every experience we label as real is filtered through our own cognitive architecture, and never directly accessed in its raw external form. In essence, the observer's prison highlights a structural isolation where all data about the universe is interpreted from within the mind, and no matter how consistent, shared, or seemingly objective that data may be, it remains mediated by internal faculties that are themselves unverifiable from the outside. Even communication with others, which appears to offer a window into different minds, ultimately relies on symbols and interpretations that loop back through the solitary chamber of one's own awareness. This leads to the paradoxical conclusion that, while we may live in a world teeming with other conscious beings and external realities, we can never directly confirm their existence beyond the performative surface of behavior, language, and assumed intention. The roots of this paradox are not merely philosophical, but also resonate with developments in neuroscience and cognitive science, which continue to demonstrate that perception is not a passive recording of the world, but an active construction shaped by prior experience, internal models, and sensory limitations. The implication is that the mind is both the only gateway to reality and a veil that occludes it entirely. This duality traps the observer in a prison that cannot be seen or touched, yet defines the limits of all understanding and existence. The paradox, therefore, forces us to confront the disquieting possibility that consciousness might be inherently self-contained, and that all attempts to verify a world beyond it are inescapably circular. Importantly, the observer's prison does not claim that external reality or other minds do not exist. Rather, it asserts that the structure of conscious observation prohibits any ultimate certainty about them, and this distinction is crucial. It is not an argument for denial, but a recognition of epistemic boundaries. In this sense, the paradox serves as a mirror to human cognition, reflecting both its astonishing capabilities and its fundamental constraints. Just as mathematical paradoxes like Banach, Tarski expose the strangeness of abstract space, the observer's prison reveals the eerie asymmetry between what the mind perceives and what it can ever definitively know. This insight has profound implications for fields as diverse as artificial intelligence, ethics, philosophy of mind, and virtual reality, all of which grapple in different ways with the challenge of understanding consciousness from the outside. It also invites a humbling perspective on our place in the cosmos, suggesting that despite all technological advancement and theoretical knowledge, we remain bound by the horizon of our own awareness, unable to step outside of it to verify what lies beyond. Thus, the observer's prison paradox stands as a haunting testament to the limitations of self-knowledge and the paradoxical solitude at the heart of conscious existence. It urges us to acknowledge the invisible cage within which all observation occurs, and to appreciate the mystery not only of the universe, but of the very act of observing it. The paradox of the unthinkable thought is a profound and unsettling reflection on the nature and boundaries of human cognition, revealing that there may exist ideas so fundamentally inaccessible to the mind that the very act of attempting to conceive them results in a kind of cognitive null space. This paradox challenges the assumption that thought is inherently unbounded, and that with sufficient effort or abstraction, any concept can eventually be grasped, or at least approximated intellectually. The unthinkable thought is not merely a complex or obscure idea, but rather one that lies entirely outside the structure of what the mind is capable of representing, or even recognizing as a possible object of consideration. Unlike problems of high computational difficulty, or questions requiring specialized knowledge, the unthinkable thought resists conceptualization in principle, because the framework of our mental faculties lacks the architecture necessary to contain it. This notion has deep philosophical implications, especially in relation to epistemology and consciousness. It raises the disturbing possibility that our sense of intellectual completeness is an illusion, bounded by the internal grammar of our cognition in the same way that certain visual illusions exploit the hardwired constraints of our perceptual system. The paradox suggests that the mind may be forever enclosed within a sphere of conceptual possibility, beyond which lies a vast and unknowable territory, not just unknown, but unknowable. What is most striking is that the paradox only becomes visible by virtue of its absence. It is the gap in thought we cannot describe. The edge of the map labeled here be dragons, but with no dragons, and no map, just the faintest echo of an impossible question. The paradox intersects with Gödel's incompleteness theorems and the limits of formal systems in a subtle yet significant way. For just as there are true mathematical statements that cannot be proven within a system, there may be meaningful thoughts that cannot be formed within a consciousness. This calls into question the assumption of cognitive closure, and highlights the structural finiteness of any self-aware agent, no matter how advanced or reflective. In cognitive science, the paradox aligns with discussions around qualia and the hard problem of consciousness, by suggesting that not only are some experiences private and ineffable, but that there may also be entire categories of experience that no conscious being could ever access, or even imagine. Interestingly, the paradox of the unthinkable thought is self-referential in its formulation. It forces us to confront the boundaries of introspection by presenting a puzzle that cannot be solved, but only acknowledged in its unsolvability. The mind trying to grasp the ungraspable is like a hand trying to hold itself, or an eye attempting to see itself directly without reflection. The moment one attempts to articulate what the unthinkable thought might be, it either collapses into contradiction, or dissolves into familiar but inadequate analogies. Thus the paradox reveals a limitation not just of language or reason, but of mental existence itself. What this means for our understanding of reality is profound. If our consciousness is structurally incapable of generating or receiving certain thoughts, then any model of the universe that assumes complete intelligibility may be fundamentally flawed. The paradox, therefore, not only speaks to the limits of individual understanding, but also to the metaphysical structure of being and knowing. It reminds us that just as a fish may never be aware of the water it swims in, we may never be aware of the conceptual medium in which our minds are suspended. The unthinkable thought, then, becomes not just a curiosity but a philosophical mirror held up to the contours of cognition, hinting at the shadowy outline of a greater intellectual landscape, forever out of reach, and yet always present as the silent perimeter of awareness. The Immortality Contradiction presents a deeply perplexing dilemma that emerges at the intersection of logic, identity, and the nature of time, proposing that the very idea of eternal life, when examined closely, leads to paradoxes that challenge our understanding of continuity, meaning, and personal identity over infinite spans of existence. At first glance, immortality appears desirable, a way to preserve consciousness indefinitely, and perhaps accumulate infinite knowledge, experience, and wisdom. However, this simple notion begins to unravel under philosophical scrutiny, especially when we consider the implications of unending subjective time and the erosion of coherent selfhood over eternity. One of the core issues arises from the problem of memory. In any sufficiently long duration, the mind would either accumulate an unmanageable quantity of experience, or be forced to forget in order to continue functioning. Both outcomes pose problems. The first leads to cognitive overload, in which the accumulation of trillions of years of memory would render all new experiences negligible or meaningless. The second implies a kind of death by forgetting, where the individual must erase parts of themselves to make room for the new, effectively ceasing to be the same person over time. This tension leads to the paradox that true immortality either collapses under the weight of infinite memory, or undermines the continuity of identity through progressive amnesia. Furthermore, the psychological impact of unending life cannot be understated. Without a natural terminus, all achievements, losses, relationships, and discoveries risk becoming trivial in the face of endless repetition, leading to a profound existential emptiness known as temporal nihilism. The notion that, given enough time, all novelty fades and meaning itself dissolves into an infinite void. Additionally, the paradox extends to the nature of motivation. Since desire and purpose are often driven by finitude, the awareness that time is limited gives urgency and significance to human actions. In a world without death, the stakes vanish, and with them, the very framework upon which value is constructed. The contradiction becomes even sharper when we consider the subjective experience of immortality. If consciousness persists in an unbroken stream across eons, the eventual result may be an indistinguishable blur, a homogeneous eternity devoid of contrast or change. In this way, immortality collapses into a kind of death, not through cessation, but through infinite dilution, where the self is not extinguished but stretched so thin across time that it becomes imperceptible. The Immortality Contradiction thus reveals the hidden cost of eternal life, exposing how the infinite can paradoxically destroy the very thing it aims to preserve: continuity, meaning, and the self. While it remains a powerful theme in myth, philosophy, and speculative fiction, its logical implications underscore a deeper truth about the value of limits and the necessity of endings in giving life structure, coherence, and purpose. By examining this contradiction, we are invited to reflect on the fragile boundaries that define identity, the psychological architecture of time, and the intricate balance between permanence and change that shapes the human condition. The Immortality Contradiction does not offer answers, but instead opens a contemplative space, where we may begin to understand that finitude is not merely a constraint, but perhaps the essential frame within which all meaningful experience takes place. The dream within a dream paradox explores the fragile boundaries between perception, consciousness, and reality, by presenting a scenario in which one becomes aware that they are dreaming, only to awaken and discover that this awakening itself is yet another layer of the dream. This layered structure creates a disorienting cascade in which each apparent return to waking life may merely be another illusion embedded within a larger dream state. The paradox draws attention to the elusive nature of certainty regarding one's conscious experience, because if each layer of awakening feels indistinguishably real, then the very notion of being awake loses its definitive grounding in subjective truth. The philosophical implications of this phenomenon resonate with ideas found in Cartesian skepticism, particularly René Descartes' suggestion that all of one's sensory experiences might be fabricated by a deceptive force, leaving no reliable criterion for distinguishing reality from illusion. In modern cognitive science and psychology, this paradox finds resonance in the study of lucid dreaming and false awakenings, where individuals report being convinced they have returned to waking life, only to later realize they remain within a dream. These experiences challenge the brain's capacity to establish a firm demarcation between dream and reality, suggesting that our waking experience may be constructed from the same neurological patterns that generate dreams. Further complexity arises when considering the nature of memory and continuity within these nested dream states, because the sense of identity and time often persists even as the contextual environment morphs seamlessly from one layer to another. This continuity contributes to the illusion of reality within each layer and reinforces the dream's internal logic, no matter how surreal it becomes. The dream within a dream paradox also evokes metaphysical questions about the structure of consciousness itself, suggesting the possibility that awareness may be a recursive or self-referential process, capable of generating internal simulations that feel subjectively authentic at every level. Some interpretations of this paradox even extend to theories in theoretical physics and simulation hypotheses, which propose that our perceived reality might itself be a construct generated by a higher-order system or intelligence. In this view, each nested dream becomes a metaphor for layers of simulated reality, each governed by its own internal consistency but inaccessible to direct verification from within. Although the dream within a dream paradox seems to undermine confidence in the reality of our waking world, it also invites a deeper curiosity about the mechanisms by which consciousness builds coherent narratives and meanings out of sensory data and memory. Ultimately, this paradox stands as a quiet yet powerful meditation on the limitations of perception, the malleability of reality, and the profound mysteries that lie hidden beneath the surface of our everyday awareness. It reminds us that even our most certain moments of lucidity may be shadows dancing on the wall of a deeper dreaming mind. The Doppelganger reality split presents a hauntingly beautiful rupture in our conventional understanding of identity, causality, and the singular nature of reality, suggesting that under certain theoretical frameworks, an individual might encounter an exact duplicate of themselves, not as a metaphor or psychological projection, but as a literal coexisting entity spawned through a bifurcation of the universe at a critical decision point. This thought experiment finds its roots in interpretations of quantum mechanics, particularly the many worlds interpretation, which proposes that every choice or quantum event spawns a new branch of reality, where each possibility plays out in its own separate but equally real timeline. In such a scenario, the concept of a doppelganger is no longer confined to folklore or speculative fiction, but emerges as an inevitable consequence of an endlessly splitting multiverse. The paradox arises when these divergent timelines are no longer entirely isolated, but instead intersect or interfere in ways that allow for the hypothetical re-encounter of these divergent selves, raising profound questions about continuity of identity, personal agency, and the ontological status of each version of self. The unsettling implication is that one's most intimate experiences, memories and motivations might be mirrored perfectly in a being that shares not only one's appearance, but also one's entire past up to the moment of divergence. From that point onward, the two selves evolve independently, but in scenarios of convergence, such as a physical overlap or observational superposition, the boundaries that define individuality begin to blur. This challenges the deeply held assumption that reality is a singular, continuous narrative, and that each person possesses a unique and unrepeatable trajectory through space and time. Instead, the Doppelganger paradox invites us to consider a layered and pluralistic conception of existence, where every choice creates not just a path but a new world populated by new versions of ourselves. The discomfort lies not in the abstract notion of multiple selves, but in the possibility of direct confrontation with a self that should not coexist within the same frame of reference. This confrontation would not only destabilize one's sense of identity, but also violate fundamental expectations of causality and spatial coherence. The Doppelganger reality split further complicates notions of consciousness and subjective experience. If two versions of you exist simultaneously, each believing themselves to be the original, and each with access to the same memories and desires, What grounds the authenticity of either? And how do we define selfhood when the internal narrative that comprises it is shared, duplicated, and diverged across countless experiential planes? The paradox does not propose that such meetings are likely, or even possible within our current physical framework. Rather, it illustrates how the assumptions underpinning personal identity and linear time unravel when applied to a multiverse context. The doppelganger reality split is less about physical doubles, and more about the philosophical implications of living in a reality that may be inherently non-singular. It urges us to question the coherence of our perceived uniqueness, and to contemplate the eerie possibility that every decision branches off not just new outcomes, but new selves, each equally valid and unknowable by the others. By examining this paradox, we are drawn into a meditative exploration of identity, reality, and the unresolvable tension between determinism and possibility. It reminds us that what we experience as a stable, coherent life may, in fact, be one thread among an infinite tapestry of alternatives, all equally real, all equally unreachable, and each containing within them another version of you. The time loop predestination problem is one of the most haunting and philosophically intricate scenarios in theoretical physics and metaphysics, suggesting that a sequence of events may be locked into a self-contained temporal loop, where cause and effect blend into a seamless and paradoxical cycle. In its most striking form, the problem raises the possibility that an action taken in the future can become the very cause of an event in the past, which in turn is the reason that future action was taken at all. This circularity defies our everyday understanding of linear time, where causes precede effects and consequences follow decisions. Yet in certain models of space-time, particularly those involving closed time-like curves, permitted under solutions to Einstein's field equations, such loops are not only mathematically plausible, but potentially inevitable. The paradox becomes most apparent when considering a person who receives knowledge or an object from the future, only to later become the source of that same knowledge or object in the past, creating a loop with no discernible origin. Such a loop seems to defy the notion of a first cause, a foundational concept in both logic and metaphysics, where every event must have an antecedent initiating condition. In the predestination scenario, causality folds in on itself, resulting in a kind of self-sustaining loop that appears complete and coherent, yet offers no explanation for its own inception. This raises deep questions about the nature of determinism and the possibility of free will, because if all actions are embedded within a loop, then the autonomy of choice becomes an illusion, and every decision is preordained not by external necessity, but by the internal mechanics of the loop itself. In physics, the time loop predestination problem often appears in discussions of time travel, where the timeline must remain consistent despite the intervention of agents from the future. This is known as the Novikov self-consistency principle, which posits that any actions taken by a time traveler were always part of history, and thus cannot alter the past in any meaningful way. While this resolves certain paradoxes, such as the grandfather paradox, it introduces a new kind of puzzle, wherein free will appears subordinate to a rigidly self-consistent universe. This deterministic framework echoes through interpretations of quantum mechanics, where the observer's influence on a system is constrained by probabilities, yet never completely random, suggesting that events might be more tightly woven into the fabric of time than our intuitions allow. Philosophically, the problem leads to a disquieting conclusion, that reality may be structured not as a chain of causes progressing through time, but as a kind of eternal tapestry in which all moments exist simultaneously, and causation is merely a pattern we impose upon them. The time loop predestination problem thus invites us to reconsider the arrow of time, and the assumption that we move inexorably from past to future. If a future event can necessitate its own past, then perhaps our perception of temporal flow is an emergent illusion, born from the limitations of our conscious experience, rather than an absolute feature of the universe. Ultimately, the time loop predestination problem stands as a profound example of how our deepest intuitions about time, causality, and agency can be called into question by the very theories designed to describe the workings of the cosmos. It challenges us to think beyond linear narratives, and consider the possibility that the universe may be far more strange, cyclical, and interconnected than our waking minds are prepared to comprehend. And in doing so, It offers a glimpse into the kind of paradoxes that arise when the boundaries between past and future begin to blur into a seamless and eternal now. The paradox of the silent universe is a compelling and deeply unsettling riddle that emerges from our study of the cosmos and our place within it, revealing a profound disconnect between expectation and observation in the realm of intelligent life. Given the vastness of the universe, with its billions of galaxies, each containing billions of stars, and likely even more planets, it seems statistically inevitable that life, intelligent or otherwise, should have arisen countless times across the cosmic expanse. Yet despite decades of listening, scanning, and searching with increasingly sophisticated instruments, the universe remains eerily silent. No definitive signals, no signs of civilization, no whisper from the stars. This stark absence of detectable life is encapsulated in what is often referred to as the Fermi paradox. But the silent universe paradox goes further. It is not simply the question of where is everyone, but rather, why should we expect to hear anything at all, and what does it mean that we don't? The silence becomes paradoxical when viewed through the lens of expectation versus reality. Because every model we construct, based on probabilistic reasoning, evolutionary biology, and astrophysics, points toward a universe teeming with communicative civilizations, and yet, we find only void. The paradox invites us to question the assumptions we place on intelligence, communication, and existence itself. Perhaps the silence is not evidence of absence, but a mirror held up to our own limitations of perception and understanding. Some theorists have proposed that advanced civilizations may self-destruct before reaching a stage of cosmic outreach. Others suggest a cosmic zoo hypothesis, wherein higher intelligences intentionally avoid contact to allow for natural development. Still others entertain the notion that we are indeed alone, a statistical anomaly in a universe otherwise indifferent to consciousness. Regardless of which explanation one finds most plausible, the paradox of the silent universe confronts us with an existential tension between what seems logically inevitable and what is empirically observable. This dissonance forces us to re-examine the tools we use to infer knowledge about reality, and to question whether our concepts of life and intelligence are too anthropocentric to capture the broader spectrum of what might be possible in the universe. Perhaps most chilling is the idea that silence itself is the only constant, and that the expectation of hearing anything at all is a uniquely human delusion, born from a deep psychological need to not be alone. This paradox thus transcends astrophysics and ventures into the philosophical, inviting reflection on the nature of existence, the boundaries of knowledge, and the profound solitude of consciousness, drifting through an indifferent cosmos. Like the Banach-Tarski paradox, which reveals a mathematical world far removed from our intuitive grasp. The paradox of the silent universe challenges not only our scientific frameworks, but also our emotional resilience in the face of a truth that may be as elegant as it is unbearable. A truth expressed not in the language of signals or contact, but in the vast, unbroken stillness of space. The missing self-illusion is a profound and deeply unsettling concept, emerging from the intersection of cognitive science, philosophy of mind, and introspective phenomenology, suggesting that the sense of a stable, continuous self may, in fact, be an elaborate construction rather than a fundamental reality. While everyday experience strongly implies that there is a core I who perceives, thinks, and acts, a closer investigation reveals that this presumed self cannot be located anywhere in the stream of consciousness, nor isolated within the brain as a discrete and consistent entity. This illusion is revealed most starkly in practices such as deep meditation or through careful introspective inquiry, where the apparent solidity of the self begins to dissolve under scrutiny, leading to a curious and paradoxical realization that while experience unfolds moment by moment, the experiencer appears to be missing. Unlike physical objects or even mental representations, which can be observed, described, and contextualized, the self as observer always seems to vanish whenever one attempts to isolate it within awareness. What remains is a field of perception, thoughts and sensations arising and passing away, but no central node to which all these experiences can be attributed. This has led many thinkers to propose that the self is not a thing, but a process, an emergent narrative continuously generated by the brain to provide coherence and continuity to disparate events over time. Cognitive neuroscientific models, such as the default mode network, offer a framework for understanding how this narrative self is constructed, suggesting that activity in certain brain regions spontaneously generates thoughts about the past, future, and identity, tying them together into a story that feels personal and ongoing. Yet this story is inherently recursive and unstable, constantly rewriting itself in light of new experiences and filtered memories. The illusion arises precisely because the brain presents this emergent story as if it were anchored in something fixed and singular, when in truth it is no more permanent than a shadow cast by flickering light. Attempts to locate a single self lead invariably to nested layers of self-referential thought, each claiming to observe the other, until the entire structure collapses into what has been described in contemplative traditions as emptiness or non-self, a state where perception remains, but without ownership. This is not merely a spiritual insight, but a scientifically consistent observation about the limitations of introspection and the constructed nature of identity. The missing self-illusion highlights how much of what we take for granted about our internal lives may be the result of complex evolutionary mechanisms, designed to produce adaptive behavior rather than accurate self-knowledge. By revealing the absence of a fixed observer at the heart of experience, this paradox invites us to question the most intimate assumptions about who we are, and to explore the strange possibility that behind every thought, emotion, and sensation, there is no enduring self, merely the quiet echo of a story told without a storyteller. The Omniscience Paradox is a profound and philosophically intricate dilemma that arises when we attempt to reconcile the concept of an all-knowing consciousness with the boundaries of logic, autonomy, and experiential understanding. At its core, the paradox explores whether it is coherent to conceive of a being, or a state of mind, that possesses complete knowledge of all truths, including future events, hidden intentions, and outcomes of all possible choices. While the notion of omniscience may seem intuitively plausible in theological or metaphysical contexts, closer examination reveals a host of conceptual difficulties that challenge our most basic assumptions about knowledge, freedom, and awareness itself. One of the central tensions in the Omniscience Paradox involves the relationship between knowledge and free will. If an omniscient entity truly knows every action that will ever be taken, including the precise choices made by autonomous agents, then the future appears to be fixed and immutable. This leads to the unsettling implication that free will is illusory, that every decision is merely the unfolding of a predetermined script already known in advance. Yet, if one attempts to preserve free will by suggesting that such knowledge could be contingent or revisable, the definition of omniscience itself begins to erode, as true omniscience cannot admit uncertainty or error. Further complicating the matter is the question of self-referential knowledge. If an omniscient mind knows all things, it must also know everything about itself, including the totality of its own mental processes, intentions, and potential thoughts. This creates a loop of infinite introspection, where each layer of self-awareness spawns yet another, deeper level of awareness that must also be known. The mind becomes an endless hall of mirrors reflecting itself back into itself, raising the question of whether it is even logically possible to be fully conscious of one's own omniscience without collapsing into paradox. Another aspect of the Omniscience Paradox touches on the idea of unknowable truths. Certain logical frameworks, such as Gödel's incompleteness theorems, suggest that in any sufficiently complex system, there will always exist propositions that are true but unprovable within the system itself. If this holds universally, then even an omniscient being might be confronted with truths that are fundamentally inaccessible, not because of any personal limitation, but due to the intrinsic structure of logic and mathematics. This introduces a deeper contradiction. If omniscience entails knowing all truths, yet some truths are logically unknowable, then the very notion of total knowledge may be self-defeating. Moreover, omniscience implies the possession of all experiential knowledge, not merely abstract facts. This means an omniscient being would need to have lived every life, felt every emotion, suffered every loss, and known every joy, simultaneously and continuously. Such a condition strains the boundaries of identity and individuality, calling into question whether a being that contains all experiences can have a coherent point of view, or a stable sense of self. It also implies an impossibility to experience something new. One must first not have known it, yet an omniscient being cannot discover anything, since all is already known. Ultimately, The Omniscience Paradox invites us to reconsider the very nature of knowledge and the limits of cognition. It reveals that our intuitive ideas about awareness, understanding, and foresight may break down when pushed to their absolute extremes. While the paradox is often discussed in theological or metaphysical settings, its implications extend into logic, epistemology, and even artificial intelligence, any domain where the concept of complete knowledge is taken seriously. By illuminating the contradictions inherent in the idea of omniscience, the paradox serves as a quiet, contemplative reminder of the beauty and strangeness that arise when the boundaries of thought are stretched to their limits. The unreachable present paradox is a subtle yet deeply unsettling concept, rooted in the philosophy of time and consciousness, revealing that the exact moment we call now is perpetually slipping through our awareness, even as we attempt to grasp it. While the past is etched into memory, and the future lies within anticipation, the present, the true instantaneous now, remains elusive and fundamentally inaccessible to direct perception. At first, this may seem counterintuitive, because we often speak and think as though we are constantly inhabiting the present moment. Yet upon closer examination, we find that all our thoughts about the present are, in fact, reflections of a slightly delayed past, processed through the neural and cognitive machinery of the brain. This delay may be imperceptibly brief, on the order of milliseconds, but it introduces a temporal gap between experience and awareness, creating a subtle disjunction that renders the present effectively unreachable. Neurological studies reveal that the brain requires a finite amount of time to register and interpret incoming sensory data, during which the present moment already begins to recede into the past. This phenomenon becomes even more pronounced in discussions of simultaneity and time perception in physics, where events occurring at the same time in one frame of reference may be perceived differently in another. According to the theory of relativity, the flow of time itself is not universal but relative and context-dependent, further complicating any fixed notion of now. These findings call into question whether there exists a singular objective present that can be universally shared, or if each conscious observer is trapped within their own continuously lagging timeline, a personalized and ever-updating approximation of reality. This paradox becomes especially poignant in contemplative thought and meditation practices, where individuals attempt to rest their attention in the now, only to find that the more they focus, the more it recedes, like a mirage in the desert. For every moment of attempted presence has already become a memory by the time it is fully known to the mind. The unreachable present thus illustrates a profound limitation of human consciousness, and challenges the notion that we can ever fully inhabit a moment without the filter of cognition and delay. From this perspective, the present is less a fixed point in time and more a constantly vanishing edge of experience, the razor-thin boundary between what has been and what is yet to come. Philosophers and scientists alike have debated whether this paradox is merely a perceptual artifact, or if it reveals something deeper about the structure of time itself. In some interpretations, the present does not exist independently at all, but is a convenient construct arising from the brain's need to integrate sensory information into a coherent narrative. This has led to the proposition that reality is composed entirely of the past and the future, with the present serving as a fleeting illusion, a seam between dimensions rather than a standalone temporal coordinate. The unreachable present paradox invites us to reconsider our assumptions about time, perception, and the nature of experience. It reveals a quiet tension between the immediacy we feel and the delay that underlies our perception, and in doing so it evokes a kind of existential vertigo, a gentle destabilization of what we thought was solid and knowable. By showing us that the moment we believe we are living in is already gone, it reminds us that consciousness itself is always slightly out of step with reality, a dance in which awareness can never quite catch up to the music of time. The mirror consciousness dilemma presents a profoundly disquieting, yet intellectually stimulating, challenge to our understanding of self-awareness and identity. It asks what happens when a conscious entity is confronted with a perfectly identical reflection, not merely in appearance, but in thought, in awareness, in the very act of observation itself. This dilemma differs from a standard reflection in that the mirrored consciousness is not passive or inert, but is instead posited to possess equal and independent subjective experience. Every perception, every memory, and every fleeting thought are mirrored in perfect synchrony, leading to an unsettling ontological tension between one's own mind and its apparent duplicate. The paradox arises from the impossibility of determining which consciousness is the original, or whether the distinction has any meaning at all. In such a configuration, subjective experience is presumed to be unique, grounded in a singular first-person perspective, but the mirror consciousness dilemma suggests a scenario in which that uniqueness collapses under the weight of absolute duplication, creating a situation where two beings share not only the same memories and sensations, but the very same moment of introspection. Philosophers and cognitive scientists have explored thought experiments akin to this dilemma, particularly in the study of split brain phenomena, identical twins raised in controlled environments, and even theoretical models of digital consciousness. Yet none capture the full recursive strangeness of the mirror consciousness dilemma, where the reflection is aware not only of you, but of itself as you, aware of itself as you, aware of itself as you, aware of it. This endless feedback loop of mutual observation leads to a breakdown in identity boundaries, casting doubt on the continuity of the self, and raising questions about whether individuality is anything more than an emergent illusion, formed by slight asymmetries in perspective or memory. Further complications emerge when one considers agency and volition. If the mirrored consciousness is identical in every respect, it must choose and act in perfect lockstep with its counterpart, thereby nullifying the possibility of independent will. This challenges the very premise of free will, suggesting that autonomy is contingent not on intrinsic mental properties, but on the impossibility of perfect replication. Moreover, the dilemma forces a reconsideration of what it means to be conscious at all. For if consciousness can be mirrored in full detail, then its supposed ineffable quality may instead be entirely mechanical and reproducible, stripping away the mystery we often associate with inner life. The mirror consciousness dilemma does not merely propose a curious thought experiment, but rather forces us to confront the fragile architecture of our perceived selfhood. By imagining a scenario in which consciousness is doubled, yet indistinguishable, it reveals how much of our identity rests on untestable assumptions about uniqueness, continuity, and separateness. It invites us to question whether the self is truly an isolated beacon of awareness, or merely a transient pattern within a broader informational field, where even the difference between self and reflection is not a metaphysical truth, but an accident of perspective and time. The grandfather of reality paradox is a deeply perplexing and metaphysically provocative thought experiment that challenges the very foundations of causality, time, and the structure of existence itself. At its core, the paradox extends the classic grandfather paradox from time travel into the broader domain of ontological recursion. It proposes a scenario in which a being or entity from the present travels into the deep past and unknowingly initiates the chain of events that will ultimately lead to the creation of the very reality they originally came from. This feedback loop forms a closed temporal circuit, where the origin of existence appears to be generated from within itself rather than from any discernible starting point, creating a situation where cause and effect no longer follow a linear progression, but instead circle endlessly through a loop of mutual dependency. In this framework, reality becomes both the parent and the offspring of its own becoming, defying our normal understanding of chronological order and logical causation. The paradox invites us to imagine a universe in which the seed of existence is planted by a traveler whose very journey depends on the outcome of that planting, and yet that outcome could not have occurred had the traveler not already existed. This circular logic destabilizes the notion of a fixed origin and raises profound questions about the nature of beginnings. If something can exist without an initial cause, or if a cause can emerge from its own effects, the entire edifice of temporal reasoning becomes vulnerable to collapse. The grandfather of reality paradox draws attention to a philosophical discomfort with self-generating systems in which identity, causality, and agency appear to emerge from a void where no grounding foundation can be located. Some interpretations suggest that the paradox mirrors the structure of consciousness itself, which may be both the observer and the construct of its perceived world. Others see in it a metaphor for the universe's potential self-sufficiency, implying that the cosmos may not require an external cause, but could instead arise from a loop of internally consistent conditions, much like a story that writes itself from its own ending. The implications of this paradox are as unsettling as they are elegant, suggesting that our search for a primal origin may be inherently misguided or even meaningless in a universe where loops supplant lines and effects may precede causes. Attempts to resolve the paradox have led to theories involving block universe models in physics, retrocausality in quantum mechanics, and even computational metaphors in which reality is seen as a self-executing algorithm with no external compiler needed to begin its function. And yet, none of these frameworks fully escape the eerie symmetry at the heart of the paradox, in which origin and destination become indistinguishable, and reality itself may be the grandparent of its own existence. By meditating on the grandfather of reality paradox, we are invited to reconsider our most basic assumptions about how time flows, why things exist, and whether the need for a beginning is merely a projection of human psychology rather than a feature of the cosmos itself. Like all powerful paradoxes, it does not merely confuse, but illuminates, exposing the subtle boundaries between explanation and mystery, and reminding us that sometimes, the most profound truths about existence emerge not from resolution but from contemplation. The infinite observer paradox is a deeply intriguing thought experiment that explores the conceptual boundaries of perception, identity, and recursion within an observational framework that seems logically coherent, yet yields a disorienting conclusion when fully examined. This paradox begins with the simple act of observation and layers it infinitely by proposing an endless series of observers, each watching the previous observer, who in turn is watching another, and so on without end. In this construction, the act of observation is not limited to a single instance but becomes an infinite regress, in which no final or original observer can be located or identified. The paradox arises when we consider the implications of this infinite hierarchy in relation to knowledge, causality, and self-awareness. Since each observer's perception is contingent upon the perception of the observer they are observing, no single perspective can be said to initiate the process or possess complete autonomy. In this way, the paradox mirrors certain problems in epistemology and metaphysics, particularly those involving foundationalism and the challenge of justifying beliefs without appealing to an infinite regress of justifications. Further complexity emerges when we attempt to reconcile this endless chain with the limits of physical reality. In a world where resources, time, and cognitive structures are finite, it seems impossible for such a scenario to manifest. Yet, within a purely abstract or hypothetical framework, the paradox remains logically possible, much like the concept of an infinite set in mathematics. While we cannot construct an actual infinite sequence in the material world, the mind is capable of conceiving one, and in doing so, confronts the tension between conceptual possibility and physical realizability. At its core, the infinite observer paradox is not merely about watching or being watched, but about the recursive entanglement of consciousness with itself, raising questions about the nature of self-reference, feedback, and the boundaries of awareness. Some interpretations draw parallels to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, or the strange loops discussed by Douglas Hofstadter, in which systems capable of self-reference inevitably encounter paradoxes that limit their consistency or completeness. If each observer is defined only through the act of being observed by another, then none of them possess an independent identity or an unambiguous point of view. This erodes the distinction between subject and object, suggesting that observation itself may be a relational construct rather than an absolute act. The implications of this for theories of consciousness and information are profound, since they challenge the idea that perception is a straightforward process with a clear beginning and end. Instead, the infinite observer paradox portrays consciousness as a network of interdependencies, each node defined only through its relation to others in an unresolvable cascade. The paradox also evokes certain themes from quantum mechanics, such as the role of the observer in collapsing a wave function. Although the analogy is not exact, both frameworks grapple with the unsettling idea that the act of observation is not a passive reception of data, but an active, and possibly infinite process that shapes the observed reality. This leads to philosophical considerations about the limits of comprehension, and the possibility that the universe, or any conscious experience, might be fundamentally unknowable if it requires an infinite regress to sustain its coherence. Ultimately, the infinite observer paradox does not admit a resolution in the traditional sense. Instead, it functions as a conceptual mirror, reflecting the limitations of human understanding and the paradoxical structure of self-awareness. By contemplating this infinite sequence, we are drawn into a mental space where linear causality dissolves, and the very notion of an independent observer becomes ambiguous. The paradox of the first cause is a deeply unsettling yet endlessly fascinating philosophical problem that challenges our most basic intuitions about existence and the origin of all things. At its heart lies a seemingly simple question. If everything has a cause, then what caused the first thing? And if something existed without a cause, how is that possible in a universe governed by causality? This contradiction pulls us into a loop where every answer seems to demand another question, and every origin begs for an earlier one. The paradox arises when we attempt to trace the chain of events in the universe backwards in time, step by step, through layers of cause and effect. If every event must have a preceding cause, then logically there can be no true beginning, only an infinite regress of causes stretching endlessly into the past. Yet the very idea of an infinite regress seems to defy the principles of logic and physics, leading many to propose that there must be a first cause, something uncaused, something that exists necessarily rather than contingently. But introducing an uncaused cause simply shifts the mystery rather than resolving it. What does it mean for something to exist without a cause, and why should this special entity be exempt from the very rule it is used to explain? Philosophers and theologians have long debated whether the first cause must be a supernatural being, an abstract principle, or some unknown aspect of the cosmos itself. In classical arguments, such as those proposed by Aquinas and Aristotle, this first cause is often equated with God, eternal, necessary, and unmoved. But modern thinkers have raised further complications, noting that invoking a timeless or causeless origin may simply be another way of saying that the question cannot be answered within our current understanding of reality. From a scientific standpoint, cosmology introduces concepts like the Big Bang as a possible origin point for time and space. However, the Big Bang itself may not be the absolute beginning, and even if it were, the question remains, why did it happen at all? What set it in motion? Was there a before the beginning? These questions push against the limits of human reason and the boundaries of empirical knowledge, suggesting that the notion of a first cause may lie outside the scope of both philosophy and science as we know them. Ultimately, the paradox of the first cause serves not merely as a puzzle to be solved, but as a mirror reflecting the limits of human understanding. It invites us to contemplate the profound mystery of why anything exists at all, and whether the framework of cause and effect that we use to navigate our world is itself a construct confined to the universe we inhabit. In doing so, the paradox lulls us into a contemplative stillness, a quiet awareness that some questions may not have answers in the traditional sense, but instead offer us a space to reflect, to wonder, and perhaps to rest.